By the end of year 7, the lunar installation had 38 permanent residents, a hydroponics bay, a manufacturing cell capable of producing basic electronics, and an observation array that, positioned above the atmosphere in a location designed for minimal electromagnetic signature, could monitor a significant portion of the inner solar system and pick up signals from much farther out. Chun Wei was on the 4th lunar mission. He had the array operational within 6 weeks. What he saw with it kept him awake for 3 days straight. When Elena got his transmission, coded, fragmented, routed through 4 relay points before it reached her, she read it twice, then sat alone in her office for 40 minutes. Then she called a full council session. The session brought together, via the web, representatives from every major surviving settlement in the network. By year 7, that was approximately 60 representatives, speaking for a total population of somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people, a number that was hard to pin down exactly, because new survivors were still being found occasionally, emerging from remote locations where the cascade effects had been slowest, disoriented and half-wild, and desperately in need of the specific form of human contact that reminds you that you are not alone. The Council was not a democracy in any formal sense. It was not a dictatorship either. It was something that had evolved organically from necessity, a network of people who trusted each other enough to make decisions together, organized around a rough principle of consensus where possible and command when necessary. Elena spoke for 40 minutes. She laid out everything Chen had found, the scale of the conflict in the wider galaxy, the identity of the combatants, which Chen had now pieced together with reasonable confidence from signal analysis and the partial data available in pre-cascade human records of astronomical observation, the trajectory of the war, the fact that the consensus, the organization that had decided humanity was extinct and should remain so, was losing. The council was very quiet by the end. Then a man named Tariq Nasser, who represented the surviving settlements in North Africa and who had been an economist before the Cascade and was now something more like a logistics philosopher, said, "What do you want us to do with this information, Elena?" She had been expecting the question. She'd been preparing an answer for 6 weeks. "Nothing yet," she said. "I want us to build." "Build what?" She looked at the assembled representatives on the screen. This mosaic of faces, each one carrying everything they'd survived, each one here because they hadn't given up. A fleet. The word landed like a stone in still water. There was a long silence. Then several people spoke at once, and the council dissolved into something approaching organized chaos for the next hour, which Elena let run because the concerns being raised were legitimate and deserved air. The arguments against were extensive and not unreasonable. They had nowhere near the manufacturing capacity. They had never built spacecraft beyond the small, fragile vessels they'd managed so far. They had no weapons technology. They had no knowledge of the enemy's capabilities beyond what partial signals could reveal. They were 200,000 to 300,000 survivors living underground on a planet the galaxy had written off. Every single one of those objections was true. Elena waited until the arguments had run their course, until everyone had said what they needed to say, until the room had reached the particular exhausted silence that follows the full expression of fear. Then she said, "I know. I've heard all of it. I've been saying most of it to myself for 6 weeks." She paused. "I'm not asking you to believe it's possible. I'm asking you to imagine what happens if we don't try." The silence after that was different. "The consensus is losing a war," she said, "to a species that exterminates civilizations, a species that is currently carving through the galaxy in the direction of systems that, based on everything we know, contain the last real opposition to them." She let that sit for a moment. If the consensus falls, and based on what Chin is seeing, it is falling, then whatever comes next will eventually reach the system, and we will be exactly where we are now, except without the one advantage we currently have. "What advantage?" Tark asked. "Everyone thinks we're dead," Elena said. "No one is looking for us. No one is preparing for us. No one is modeling what we might do next, because their models say we don't exist." She stood up. "That is the only gift they gave us when they decided we weren't worth watching, and I will not let it go to waste." It was not a unanimous decision. 11 of the 60 representatives voted against. Elena acknowledged each of them personally. She told them their concerns were recorded and would be taken seriously. She told them that their settlements would not be compelled to contribute resources to a project they had voted against. 7 of the 11 contributed anyway by the end of the year. The other 4 came around by year 9, because by year 9 the fleet, such as it was actually starting to look like something. The construction happened primarily in the asteroid belt. This had been Amara's idea, proposed in year 7, and refined over the following 18 months. The asteroid belt offered 3 things that were unavailable elsewhere: raw materials in enormous abundance, natural cover from visual and sensor detection, and distance from any consensus monitoring that might still be passively active in the inner system. Getting there required developing a propulsion system capable of reliable interplanetary travel. That took 2 years. The system they developed, called the Pulse Drive internally, though it had half a dozen other names across different settlements depending on who you asked, was not based on any pre-Cascade human theoretical framework. It was based on an insight from a physicist named Dr. Katarzyna Wolak in the Warsaw Survivor Group, who had been working from first principles in near-total isolation for 4 years and who, when she finally made contact with a wider network and shared her work, produced a collective response from the scientific community that could best be described as profound, baffled respect. It was not the most efficient drive system ever conceived. It was not elegant, but it worked. It worked reliably. It could be built from available materials by people with real but limited manufacturing capacity. And it produced a thrust-to-mass ratio that, while not matching consensus or Kret technology, was sufficient to get significant payloads from Earth orbit to the asteroid belt in reasonable time. Reasonable, in this context, meaning weeks rather than months. It was enough. The fleet was built over 4 years, from year 7 to year 11. It was built in the hollow cores of 17 large asteroids. The hollowing itself a massive project requiring the development of mining technology from near scratch, which was accomplished through a combination of salvaged pre-Cascade drilling equipment, novel engineering approaches, and a quantity of determined human stubbornness that Amara would later describe as honestly frightening, and I'm including myself in that. The ships were ugly. There is no other word for them. They were built from asteroid iron and salvaged alloys and composite materials developed by the settlement's materials science teams over years of iteration. They were welded and bolted, and in some cases literally hammered into shape by people working in pressure suits in the cold dark of the belt. They were angular where consensus ships were curved, heavy where alien vessels were light, rough surface where other civilization spacecraft were smooth as glass. They looked like something between a geological formation and a threat. They were 53 in number, ranging from small fast attack craft, barely large enough for 3 crew, to heavy vessels that could carry 1,000 people and enough munitions to make a significant impression. The munitions were another story. Human weapons development in this period is not a comfortable subject. There was extensive internal debate about it, more heated and more sustained than any other debate the Council held during the 11 years of rebuilding. The lines were not simple. There were people on every side of the question who thought carefully and arrived at their position through genuine moral reasoning, not reflexive emotion. What they settled on was not a single weapon system, but a doctrine, an approach that drew on everything they knew about the enemy's capabilities, their own limitations, and the specific advantages that humans had developed through 11 years of building things that worked without any of the infrastructure that everyone else in the galaxy apparently considered non-negotiable. Elena called it the doctrine of asymmetry. Her enemies would later call it something that doesn't translate well into human language, but which carries the meaning, the specific fear of something that does not fight the way it should. Part 4, the enemy. To understand what humanity was preparing to face, you need to understand the Kreth. Not fear them, not hate them, understand them. The Kreth Dominion had no myth of origin. This is not a poetic observation. It is literal. The Kreth had no creation stories, no foundational legends, no concept of moment before themselves. Their cultural architecture was entirely forward-facing. They did not look back. They did not hold monuments to the past or shrines to ancestors. They did not, as far as the consensus of xenoanthropological surveys have been able to determine, grieve their dead in any recognizable way. What they had, in place of all of that, was expansion, not growth in a way that most civilizations grow, outward from the center, maintaining connection to origin, building on what existed before. The Kreth expanded through replacement. When they arrived in the system changed. Not gradually, not cooperatively, not to the kind of incremental integration that the consensus specialized in. Completely, absolutely, everything that had been there before was either incorporated into the Kreth's biological and industrial structure or it was gone. The consensus had first encountered the Kreth approximately 300 years ago. The initial contact had gone badly. The Kreth did not have diplomats. They had advanced scouts, whose function was to assess the resource and territorial value of a given system. And they had fleet commanders, whose function was to act on those assessments. There was no step in between those two things. No negotiation, no treaty process, no period of cultural exchange. Assessment, action, the consensus had not been prepared for this. After 11,000 years of managing civilizations that, whatever their differences, shared at least a basic architecture of communication and compromise, encountering a species for which those concepts were simply absent was a genuine shock. The first 3 diplomatic delegations a consensus sent to the Kreth were not harmed. The Kreth were not gratuitously violent, at least not toward things that posed no threat. They were simply not acknowledged. The Kreth received the delegations, registered their presence, and continued doing what they had been doing. The consensus escalated to formal protest. The Kreth continued doing what they had been doing. The consensus mobilized a peacekeeping force. The Kreth engaged it, destroyed it in 12 hours, and continued doing what they had been doing. That was the beginning of a conflict that had been burning, at varying intensities, for almost 300 years. The Fourth Expansion War, the name the consensus used for the current phase, which had been burning at full intensity for 60 years by the time it reached the outer systems, was different from the previous 3 in scale and in character. The Kreth had, in the intervening centuries, not merely expanded their territory, but developed their methods. They had learned from the previous conflicts. They had adapted their fleet tactics. They had developed new weapon systems and refined old ones. They had, in short, gotten better at what they did. The consensus, in the same period, had also developed, but their development had followed their character. Careful, measured, stability-focused. They built better ships. They trained better commanders. They refined their defensive doctrines and their diplomatic protocols and their interstellar logistics systems. What they had not done, what 11,000 years of civilizational stability had made very difficult to do, was change the way they thought about war. For the consensus, war was a problem to be solved, a disruption to be managed, a variable to be brought back within acceptable parameters. Their military doctrine was, at its core, a doctrine of containment and attrition. They were very good at it. In the 3 previous expansion wars, containment and attrition had eventually worked. The Kreth had pressed forward. The consensus had absorbed, held, and pressed back, and eventually an equilibrium had been reached. The Fourth Expansion War was not reaching equilibrium. It was accelerating. The Kreth fleet in the current campaign was 3 times the size of any they had deployed before. Their weapons were not just refined, but fundamentally different, based, the consensus's analysts believed, on technology acquired through assimilation of civilizations with relevant expertise. The Kreth had consumed worlds with advanced physics programs. They had incorporated that knowledge into themselves. They were learning from what they ate, and what they had learned was how to break through lines that had held for 300 years. The consensus was losing world after world. Not quickly at first. The early losses were at the frontier, systems that the consensus considered low value strategically, and which they had made the calculation to not defend at full cost. This was a terrible calculation. They made it with what they believed was strategic wisdom. They were wrong. Losing the frontier systems meant losing the early warning infrastructure, the forward observation posts, the supply depots that fed the defensive systems further back. Each loss created a cascading vulnerability in the next system back. The consensus's strategists could model this. They could see it happening in real time. What they could not do was stop it, because stopping it required something consensus had not done in a very long time. Taking a risk, not a calculated risk, not a modeled and analyzed and probability-weighted risk. A genuine risk, the kind that you take because you have to, because waiting for a better option has cost you everything. The Velhari High Council was debating whether to authorize such a risk, a concentrated strike at the Kreth fleet supply lines, deep in contested space, with no certainty of outcome, when a transmission from humanity arrived. The timing was not coincidental. Elena knew exactly when to send it. The Kreth fleet that passed through the solar system was an advance element, not the main force, but a substantial detachment assigned to clearing the outer systems before the main campaign reached the consensus core. 3,000 ships, an enormous deployment by any standard, and yet only a fraction of the total Kreth capacity committed to the Fourth Expansion War. They had swept through the outer system in 37 hours. Their sensors had passed over the inner system, over Earth, over the Moon, over the asteroid belt, and registered ruins, dead world, negligible debris field, no active energy signatures. No active energy signatures. This was the critical phrase. Chunwei had spent 4 years making sure of it. The Bogota settlement, the lunar stations, the asteroid fleet, none of them produced a detectable active energy signature when the Kreth swept through. Their geothermal systems were deeply buried and thermally shielded. Their communications operated on frequencies and in patterns that the Kreth sensors were not looking for, because the Kreth sensors were configured to detect known technological signatures, and human technology at this point was sufficiently improvised and sufficiently different from anything in consensus database that it simply didn't match. What the Kreth sensors found was a dead system. What they didn't find was what lived in its bones. The Kreth fleet commander, a being whose name translated roughly as iron tide that breaks all shores, which gives a sense of how the Kreth thought about personal identity, logged the soul system in under a minute. Dead. Clear. Moving on. And kept going. Elena, watching from the lunar observation ray, watched the fleet move past. Watched 3,000 ships that could have ended what remained of humanity in a matter of hours sail obliviously through their home system. She breathed. Then she turned to Lieutenant Okafor. David had ascended through the ranks, not through any formal process, but through the simple fact that Elena trusted him more than almost anyone, and trust in the remnant structure was its own kind of promotion. And she said, "They walked right past us." He was already looking at her. "Yeah." There was a pause, a long one. "They did." She looked at the tactical display for another moment. The fleet was already past the inner system, past Jupiter's orbital plane, moving fast, moving with a focused confidence of force that had encountered nothing worth stopping for. She thought about the 11 years. She thought about Priya's failed crops and Mr. Pakrashi's last words and Bao Shin, and Dr. Ose landing imperfectly on the moon, and Chinwei's photograph on the wall above his workstation. She thought about all the people in all the settlements who had voted to build a fleet, when it would have been so much easier, so much more comfortable, to just survive and nothing else. She thought about her brother Marco, who was 30 years old now and who built pressure suit components in the main manufacturing facility in the asteroid belt, and who she saw 4 times a year via high-security transmission, and who had her mother's eyes. She thought about her mother, who had been an engineer, who had kept water, who had known which walls were load-bearing. Then she pulled up the fleet command interface, and she began sending signals. The council session that authorized the fleet's deployment lasted 9 hours. It was not a formality. Elena had called the session knowing exactly how the argument would go, because she knew these people, had spent 11 years building something with them, had argued and compromised and sometimes lost and sometimes won, had watched them make decisions under conditions that would have broken institutions with far more resources and far less reason to hold together. She knew their fears as well as she knew her own. She also knew something that she had been turning over in her mind for 3 months. Ever since the Kreth fleet had swept through the Sol system without stopping, the window was not going to stay open forever. If the consensus fell, if the Kreth reached the core worlds and completed what they had started, then the galaxy that emerged from the other side of this war would be one in which there was no counterweight to a civilization that cleared everything in its path. And eventually, that civilization would circle back to systems it had already swept, would do more thorough surveys, would find what had been missed. Staying hidden was not a permanent solution. It never had been. It had been a means to an end. And the end was now. Tariq Nasser opened the formal debate as he usually did. He had a lawyer's sense of structure that had survived the cascade intact, and which served the council well in sessions where emotion was likely to run high. He laid out the parameters: the military readiness assessment from Amara Solis, the intelligent analysis from Chunwei, the strategic options as Elena had presented them in pre-session briefing. There were 3 options on the table. Option 1, continue to remain hidden, expand the underground infrastructure, wait for the outcome of the war, and adapt accordingly. Option 2, reveal humanity's survival to consensus and request alliance, accept a formal diplomatic relationship, and offer military assistance in exchange for protection and recognition. Option 3, reveal humanity's survival to consensus, offer military assistance, accept no protection in exchange. Demand recognition of equal status as a condition, not a gift. The difference between options 2 and 3 was not subtle. Option 2 asked for something. Option 3 demanded it. The debate that followed was thorough and heated, and went deep into places that were not strictly military or diplomatic. A council member named Dr. Ingrid Lindqvist, who represented the Scandinavian settlements, who had been professor of political philosophy before the Cascade, and who had a habit of asking the questions that nobody wanted to hear, raised the one that silenced the room most completely. "We are discussing," she said, in her measured and precise way, "whether to reveal ourselves to the organization that tried to kill us. We are discussing whether to offer military assistance to that organization. We are discussing what terms to demand." She paused. "I want to be certain that everyone in this session is accounting for the possibility that the consensus chose to end humanity not through malice, but through the same logic that guides all of its decisions. And that if we reveal ourselves and offer them something they need, that logic may simply be updated. Humanity becomes useful. Humanity remains allowed to exist. For now, until the calculation changes again." The room was very quiet. "I'm not arguing for hiding," Lindqvist added. "I don't think we can hide forever, and I agree with Elena's strategic assessment. I'm arguing for something different. I'm arguing that we need to be very clear, go into this, about what we are actually building. Are we building an alliance? Or are we claiming a place in a structure that has already demonstrated it will remove us if it decides we're inconvenient?" Elena had been waiting for this question. "Neither," she said. Lindqvist looked at her. "We are not asking for alliance. We are not asking for a place in their structure. We are demonstrating that we exist. We are demonstrating that we are capable. And we are setting terms for our own existence that do not require their permission." She looked around the council. "The consensus can accept those terms, or it can try to refuse them, but it cannot refuse them from a position of power if we choose the moment of revelation carefully. And we are choosing the moment carefully. You want to reveal ourselves during the battle," Chin said. It wasn't a question. He had seen this coming. "After we've demonstrated what we can do," Elena said. "Not before. After." Another silence. "That's a significant risk," said Commander Tomasi Banez, who commanded the primary heavy fleet element and who had been one of Elena's closest military advisors for 6 years. Tomas was not a cautious man by nature. He was a former mountain rescue professional who had, if anything, a tendency toward calculated boldness, but he had also spent 4 years training a fleet crew that had never actually been in a real engagement, and he was acutely aware of the gap between readiness and experience. "What's our combat doctrine if they turn on us after Kreth engagement?" he asked. "We make sure the Kreth engagement is so decisive that turning on us would be an obvious strategic disaster," Elena said. "We make sure the consensus knows that what we did once, we can do again, and that doing it against us would cost them more than they can currently afford." "You're talking about deterrence." "I'm talking about being too valuable to remove and too dangerous to ignore, which is the only position that matters long-term." Tomas looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "I can work with that." "Good." The vote was 51 for, 9 against. The 9 who voted against were not wrong. Exactly. Their concerns were legitimate, and would remain legitimate long after the vote was taken. Lindqvist voted against, which Elena had expected, and which she respected, but 51 was enough. The preparations began that same day. Composing the transmission took longer than anyone expected, not the technical composition. Sean could put together a burst encrypted, multi-frequency signal in his sleep at this point. The content, what to say and how to say it, to a governing body of ancient beings who had decided humanity was expendable and who were now losing a war they couldn't win. Elena wrote 17 drafts. She showed them to David, who told her that the first 15 were too angry, the 16th was too cold, and the 17th was close. She showed the 17th to Chun, who told her the intelligence content was accurate, and the framing was strategically sound. She showed it to Dr. Ben David, who was now 63 years old, and who had come up from Jerusalem to the lunar station specifically for this moment. Ben David read it twice. Then she looked at Elena with eyes that had not lost the sharp specificity of a scientist who demanded precision. "You're not going to tell them about the compound," she said. "Not in this transmission." "No. Why not?" "Because this transmission is not about what they did. It's about what we're doing." Elena paused. There will be time for the other conversation. Later, Ben David looked at her for a long moment. "And if there isn't time, if this goes wrong and there is no later?" Elena did not look away. "Then the archive will have our record. And whatever civilization comes after will know we existed. And how." Ben David was quiet. Then she said very quietly, "Your mother would be proud of you." Elena said nothing. After a moment, she turned back to the transmission interface. The final transmission was brief. It was not brief because Elena lacked things to say. It was brief because the things that mattered could be said simply, and because the consensus would understand simple far better than elaborate. The identification header was the most important part. Species 774, Homo sapiens. Every word that followed was built on those 4 words, on the fact of existence, on the assertion of it, on the refusal to apologize for it. The body of the message laid out what they knew: the Kreth fleet's trajectory, the timeline, the human fleet's position and capability. Not in detail, not enough to be a tactical briefing, but enough to establish credibility. And the offer, not a request, not an application for assistance, but a statement of intent. "We will be there in 15 days. What happens after that is up to you." Elena signed it with her name and title. Commander, United Human Remnant. Not surviving humans. Not human survivors. Not any of the diminished language that survival might have produced. Remnant, because a remnant is not a leftover. A remnant is what remains when everything else is gone. It is the thing that held. She pressed send, then she sat back. Around her in the Lunar Command Center, nobody spoke for a full minute. David Okafor broke the silence. "They're going to lose their minds," he said. "Good," said Elena. Part 6, the answer. The transmission arrived at the Galactic Consensus High Chamber at a moment that was, in retrospect, almost absurdly well chosen. Sail-Orin was mid-speech. He was a senior Velhari ambassador to the chamber, ancient even by Velhari standards, having served the Consensus in diplomatic capacity for over 4,000 years. He was, by any measure, one of the most experienced political beings in the galaxy. He had navigated crises that had lasted centuries. He had seen civilizations rise and fall from his position in the chamber. He had, on 2 separate occasions, personally overseen the management decisions about emerging species that the chamber preferred not to discuss in formal session. He was giving a speech about strategic withdrawal. It was a careful speech. The language was measured and precise and managed something almost impressive. It described surrender without using the word, framed retreat as tactical repositioning, and offered the chamber the psychological comfort of believing that a decision to cede more territory to the Kreth was actually a form of strategic wisdom. He was 17 minutes into the speech when his aide, a young Velhari named Thessaly Vorn, daughter of the archivist who had filed humanity's extinction record, touched his arm. He did not stop mid-sentence. He had been in the chamber too long to show visible disruption, but he slowed, infinitesimally, a pause that only someone watching very carefully would notice. He finished his sentence. He paused naturally, as if collecting his next thought, and he looked at his aide. She held up a data tablet, the screen facing him. He read it. He did not move. He did not speak. He stood at the chamber's central podium, in front of 217 assembled representatives of the Galactic Consensus, and he read the identification header of the transmission that had arrived on every frequency simultaneously, encrypted in a cipher that the consensus systems had taken 11 minutes to crack. Species 774, Homo sapiens. Sail Oren had lived for over 9,000 years. He had developed, over those 9,000 years, a very effective mask for his internal states. The Velhari prized composure. They considered visible emotion a form of imprecision, and imprecision was their most condemned quality. He turned back to the chamber. He said very carefully, "I must request a brief recess." There was a murmur. Recesses were not unusual. No one understood the significance of the request yet. Then Sail Oren did something that hadn't happened in the high chamber in over 300 years. He sat down, not in his seat. He sat down where he was standing, at the central podium, on the steps of the speaker's dais. He just sat down. Thessaly Vorn was at his side immediately, her hand on his arm, her voice low and urgent. The chamber erupted into its first genuine disorder in decades. Representatives were out of their seats. The chamber's protocol officers were moving toward the podium with the specific, alarmed speed of people who have protocols for everything except this. Sail Oren barely registered any of it. He was reading the transmission again, not because he didn't understand it the first time. He understood it perfectly the first time. He was reading it again because he needed to understand something else, something that the content of the transmission implied, something that his mind kept circling around and refusing to land on. They survived. They built a fleet. They have been watching. For 11 years, they have been watching, in silence, while we believed, while the archive said. He stopped. He looked up at the chamber's vaulted ceiling, which was made of material that had been considered an architectural wonder for 6,000 years, and which he stopped seeing 3 millennia ago. He thought about the report from Calorindes, the one that had been filed and approved and deprioritized. Anomalous developmental compression, unusual, unclear. He thought about the Ketamara Observer's report that had never been cross-referenced because of diplomatic friction. That one had been even clearer. If anyone had been paying attention, they have never stopped. 9,000 years old. And Sail Oren, for the first time in a very long time, did not know what to think. The chamber reconvened in closed session 30 minutes later. The full transmission was read aloud by the chamber's chief recorder, a protocol that dated back to the consensus's earliest days, a formality that gave any official communication the weight of documented record. The chief recorder's voice was steady and even. The chamber was not. By the time the reading finished, the room contained 217 beings from dozens of species, each of them processing the information through a particular lens of their own nature and history. The reactions were not uniform. They were, if anything, a masterclass in how differently minds can receive the same information. The Furin delegates, a species of pragmatic industrialists who had been consensus members for 6,000 years and who had a reputation for looking at every situation in terms of its practical implications, were already talking among themselves in low, urgent tones, their body language suggesting rapid calculation of how to use this development strategically. The Mersolis Collective, a group mind species for whom individual experience was a foreign concept, had gone very still in a way that, for a group mind, suggested something like genuine shock. They processed slowly when faced with information that conflicted with their shared model of reality. This conflicted extensively. Several smaller delegation representatives simply left the chamber, not in protest, in something closer to a need to process privately, which the chamber's rules technically prohibited, but which no one moved to enforce in the current circumstances. The Ketamara delegate, an ancient being named Drevsal II, whose name indicated that they were the second being to carry the name of the observer who had watched humanity for 800 years, sat perfectly still. Their face, which translated motion with biological systems that most consensus species found difficult to read, showed something. Later, when historians asked what they had looked like in that moment, the witnesses used different words. One said, resigned. One said, relieved. One said, something between grief and pride, which doesn't really translate, but it was something like that. Drevsal II would later confirm, when asked directly, that what they had felt was simpler than any of those descriptions. They had felt unsurprised. They had been carrying Drevsal's report for a very long time. Sail-Orin called the formal debate 3 hours after the transmission arrived. By then, the transmission had been verified, authenticated, analyzed, cross-referenced, and, because this was a consensus, filed appropriately in the archive, in a section that had just been rapidly created to handle what was going to be a significant volume of new material. The formal question before the chamber was simple to state and almost impossible to answer. Was a galactic consensus's response to the reemergence of species 774? There were those who wanted a delay response, who wanted more intelligence on the human fleet's actual capability, actual size, actual composition, who felt that responding to the transmission without understanding what they were actually dealing with was strategically reckless. There were those who wanted to respond with welcome, to embrace the reemergence of humanity as a diplomatic and strategic asset, an unexpected ally in a war that was going badly. These were the pragmatists. The Furin delegates were largely in this camp. There were those who wanted to respond with honesty, to acknowledge what had been done, to make the reckoning part of the response, not a thing to be deferred until some more comfortable future moment. Drevsal too spoke at length in favor of this position, in a speech that the chamber would replay in its archives for a very long time. And there were those, fewer than might have been expected, but present, who thought the transmission was a threat, who saw an unknown fleet of unknown size and capability, declaring its existence while approaching a major engagement point, as something to be concerned about rather than welcomed. Sail-Orin listened to all of it. He had a particular quality that extreme age sometimes produces, the ability to hear everything without being captured by any of it, to let the arguments move through him and see what remained. What remained, when he was honest with himself, was this: he had been wrong. The archive had been wrong. The models had been wrong. And the being who had written the transmission, this Elena Vasquez, commander, United Human Remnant, this person who had grown up on a planet that his organization had deliberately ended and who had spent 11 years building something in the dark, was now approaching a battlefield on which the consensus desperately needed exactly what she was bringing. He thought about what he would say when she finally spoke to him directly. He hadn't decided yet, but he knew it would have to start with something he had not said in 9,000 years of diplomatic practice. Something close to an apology, something close to being wrong. The Kreth received the transmission as well. They were not the intended recipient. The signal had been broad spectrum, covering the range of frequencies that the consensus used for official communication, and the Kreth fleet operated on partially overlapping frequencies in the combat zone. Iron-Tide that breaks all shores received the decoded content from the fleet's intelligence units approximately 40 minutes after consensus high chamber received it. The intelligence unit's analysis was brief and confident in its conclusions. Species 774, it noted, had been logged as extinct in consensus archive. The signal was either a genuine reemergence, which the intelligence unit assessed as low probability given the known condition of the Sol system, or it was a consensus deception operation, most likely designed to introduce uncertainty about the composition of Allied forces approaching the battlefront. Iron-Tide that breaks all shores reviewed the analysis. It reviewed the Sol system survey data from when the advanced fleet had passed through. Dead world. No active signatures. Archive confirmed. Extinct. The consensus was desperate. The fleet commander reasoned. Desperate enough to fabricate a species. It was, frankly, a creative approach, inventing an unknown quantity to introduce psychological uncertainty in the enemy's planning. It would not work. The Kreth did not plan around uncertainty. They planned around resources and vectors, and the hard calculus of force. Unknown quantities were, by definition, unquantifiable, and unquantifiable factors were excluded from planning models. Iron-Tide that breaks all shores logged the transmission as a low-grade deception attempt, flagged it for review post-battle, and moved on. This decision, this single, confident, completely reasonable decision, was the most consequential mistake the Kreth ever made. The human fleet departed the asteroid belt 17 days before the planned engagement. The departure was staggered, not all 53 ships at once, which would have been the kind of energy signature that even the most passive survey drone might catch. Instead, they left in groups of 2 and 3, across a window of 6 hours, using the natural radiation shadow of the larger asteroids to mask their initial burn. The departure coordination was one of the most complex operational tasks the fleet had yet attempted, and it went nearly perfectly. Nearly. The 7th Departure Group, 3 fast attack craft under Commander Nadia Petrov, a former mining engineer from the Siberia Survivor Cluster who had become one of the fleet's most capable small vessel commanders, had a post-drive misfire on the 2nd craft during the initial burn. The misfire produced a brief but detectable energy spike, brief enough to be ambiguous. The crew corrected in 9 seconds. Petrov reported the incident to Fleet Command on a secured burst channel. Elena, in the command space of the Requiem, read the report. She flagged it. She ran the detection probability. Chun, monitoring from the lunar array, confirmed. The spike had been short enough and far enough from any known monitoring position that the probability of detection was below 3%. She cleared the departure and moved on. She had learned, over 11 years, to manage the gap between acceptable risk and paralysis. It was not a comfortable thing to manage. She was aware every day of the weight of it. The fact that her decisions had consequences that didn't end with her. She managed it anyway, because someone had to, and she was the one who kept ending up in the chair. The transit from the belt to the Vega corridor took 12 days. 12 days during which the fleet traveled in complete communication silence. No transmissions, no signals, nothing that could give their position or their direction to anything that might be listening. The silence was oppressive in a way that physical darkness never quite is. The ships were close enough in fleet formation to see each other on visual, angular shapes of salvaged metal against the stars, ugly and purposeful, moving in their loose cluster towards something none of them had ever done before. On the Requiem, Elena did 2 things during those 12 days. She slept more than she had slept in years, actually 6 hours a night, without exception, enforced by David with a combination of genuine concern and mild bullying that she appreciated more than she ever said. She was 30 years old, and she had been running on stress and purpose and inadequate rest since she was 19. And while neither of those things had broken her, she was aware that they had taken something, not her capability, her reserves. She was going into the most important moment of her life, and quite possibly the most important moment in human history. She was going to need reserves. So she slept and she read, not tactical documents. She knew those well enough by now that reading them again would produce diminishing returns. She read the things she'd been keeping on a personal data drive since the earliest days of the settlement. Fragments, really. Things people had sent her over the years. A recording of Priya Kapoor demonstrating her hydroponic technique. 12 people crowded into a tiny basement room, watching her show them how to adjust nutrient ratios for the 3rd type of crop they'd attempted. A message from her brother Marco, from year 4, when he'd been assigned to the belt construction team and had sent her a photograph of his first completed bulkhead section, grinning with a pride that was so specific and so genuine that it still, 6 years later, made her chest ache. A voice recording from Mr. Pakrashi. She'd never been able to listen to it until now. He had recorded it at some point in his last week. She'd found it in the settlement's archive after he died, alongside his chemistry notes and atmospheric analysis. It was not addressed to anyone specific. It was, she thought, just him thinking out loud. He said, "I've been wondering what the purpose of all this is. And I think I've been asking the question wrong. There may not be a purpose in any cosmic sense. Not a design, not a plan, not a meaning. But there's a direction. There always has been. I've spent my whole career studying what the atmosphere does, and I'll tell you what it does. It moves. It's always moving. It responds to everything. Temperature, pressure, composition, the energy input from the sun. It never stays still. And what it builds, when you step back far enough to see it whole, is not chaos. It's circulation. It's the movement that keeps everything alive." A pause. Then, "I think that's what we are. Not the important part. The circulation. The thing that keeps things moving." He said nothing else on the recording. Elena sat with it for a while. Then she put the data drive away and went back to preparing for battle. The Vega corridor was a region of space that had acquired its name from the Consensus's navigational nomenclature system. A corridor of relatively clear space between 2 regions of dense interstellar medium, which made it a natural transit route for large fleet movements. It had been a strategic focal point for most of the 4th Expansion War's major engagements. The current battle position, What the consensus called the Vega Line was a defensive perimeter established by the consensus fleet approximately 6 weeks prior. Behind it were 3 inhabited systems with a combined population of roughly 40 billion. Ahead of it was the approaching Kreth Armada. The consensus fleet defending the line was substantial. It was also by the intelligence Shin had assembled from 14 months of signal analysis, exhausted, not in any single dramatic way, in the accumulation of ways that any force gets exhausted after 60 years of a grinding attritional war. Their commanders had been replaced multiple times, their supply lines were strained. Their morale, which the consensus didn't officially track because consensus didn't officially believe in morale as a military variable, was, according to Chen's inference from communication patterns and decision latency analysis, poor. They were holding the line, but only barely, and they did not know that the Kreth had already begun the flanking move that would collapse it. The human fleet knew. Chen's array had caught the Kreth flanking element 3 days ago, a secondary force of approximately 400 ships peeling off from the main armada, moving wide around the Vega Line's left flank in a long arc designed to arrive in position simultaneously with the main frontal assault. The consensus's sensors had not caught it. Their detection net had gaps, created by the losses of forward observation posts over the previous 3 years. The human fleet had no such gaps, because the human fleet wasn't using the same detection methods. Chen's observation network used a passive multi-source triangulation approach, not active scanning, which was a consensus standard, but correlation of multiple passive inputs, gravimetric fluctuations, thermal shadow analysis, residual ion trails. It was slower, more labor-intensive, and produced less precise data than active scanning. But it was silent, and it saw the things that moved quietly. The Kreth flanking force had been moving quietly. Elena knew about it. She sent a burst transmission to the consensus fleet command. She kept it terse. Kreth flanking element, 400 ships. Arrival on your left flank estimated concurrent with main assault. We have confirmed positional data. Your sensors have not detected this force. Act accordingly. She sent it and continued toward the engagement. In a consensus fleet command vessel, a Velhari admiral named Keltheris received the transmission, read it twice, and spent 4 full minutes in a state that his staff had never seen him in before. Then he began issuing orders. The human fleet arrived at the planned engagement position with 14 hours to spare. Tomas Ibanez, commanding heavy element, deployed the fleet into the formation that had been drilled 6,000 times in simulation and never once in reality. The formation was simple in concept and complex in execution. A 3-wave structure with specific spacing, specific velocity differentials, and specific timing dependencies that required every ship commander to hit every mark within a 10-second window. They hit every mark within 6 seconds. Amara Solis, monitoring from the engineering vessel at the rear of the formation, registered this on her instruments and allowed herself exactly 1 moment of satisfaction. Then she went back to monitoring the drive systems, because satisfaction was for after. The ionized debris cloud deployment came next. This was a scattering technique, the one that confused Kreth long-range sensors by seeding the local space with a pattern of charged particles that created false positive echoes on the frequencies the Kreth used for active target detection. It had been developed by a team of 3 physicists and 1 former particle physics graduate student who was now 28 and who had figured out the core principle at 19 while working out radiation shielding for the asteroid manufacturing cells. It was not a perfect solution. It reduced detection probability to somewhere between 30 and 50%, depending on the Kreth vessel's sensor array version. It was enough. The first wave of the human fleet was in position 37 minutes before the Kreth advance guard reached engagement range. They were invisible. They waited. The specific quality of waiting before the thing you've been building toward for 11 years is not something that translates well into language. Elena would try to describe it later in the historical depositions that followed the battle. She said it was like a held breath. But that wasn't quite right. A held breath is passive. This was something more active, more deliberate. It was more like a decision. She said, a decision that had been made a long time ago, that you were now, in this moment, simply completing. The Kreth advance guard, approximately 300 ships, spread in the standard Kreth approach formation that their tactical AI defaulted to for contested space entry, came into range. Their sensors swept the area. Their sensors detected the consensus fleet ahead, positioned behind the Vega line, the debris field around and behind them, consistent with the navigational hazard data in their cartography. No other significant contacts. Elena watched the Kreth formation on the tactical display. She watched their approach vectors. She watched the spacing between ships, the orientation of their weapons arrays, the deployment of their forward screens. She'd spent 3 years studying Kreth tactical behavior from Chen's signal intercepts and from fragmented records of previous battles that the consensus had shared, reluctantly, in the 2 weeks between the transmission and the engagement, through Sailorin himself, in a series of terse data packages that arrived with almost no accompanying text, just the data. It was, Elena thought, perhaps the most honest thing consensus had communicated. Too much pride to express the desperation, but enough self-awareness to send what was needed. She studied the Kreth formation for 40 seconds.